screen. Okay, we're in business. We're in business.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. It's my pleasure now to introduce Oliver Leaman. Oliver Leaman is a professor of philosophy at the University of Kentucky. Professor Leaman's primary research interests lie in the areas of Islamic, Jewish, and Eastern philosophies. To this end, Oliver has an enormous list of publications, including an introduction to medieval Islamic philosophy, published with Cambridge in 1985, Controversies in Contemporary Islam with Routledge in 2013, and Islam and Morality, a Philosophical Introduction, which he published with Bloomsbury in 2019. His response today is titled The Falsafa Project in Between Islamic Philosophy and Jewish Philosophy. Oliver.
Thank you very much. And I just must apologize to colleagues for changing the time and having to leave early. I'll be coming back, but I have some childcare responsibilities today. Everybody always seems to get sick when I arrive in London, and I have to run around looking after a variety of children. But I'll have to go off at 3 to pick a kid up from school, but I'll be coming back very soon after. I do apologize. Right, so I'm going to talk a bit about Jewish thinkers and Falsafa. First of all, let me say, I don't think I'm interested in the title of this project as Falsafa, because Falsafa is an unusual word to use to describe, Islamic Arabic philosophy. It's normally known as sort of hikmah, really. And Falsafa, I think of as a more technical mashai sort of eponym, the idea of peripatetic philosophy rather than philosophy in general. And in the Islamic world, it's not necessarily the most popular. Falsafa is more technical, it's more academic, it's more theoretical, it's less obviously connected with the sorts of concerns that people of a religious disposition are interested in. But in the Jewish world, from a very early time, there was a great deal of interest in Islamic philosophy, right from, it's not just in Jewish philosophy, but also in Jewish theology. I mean, we shouldn't forget that philosophy, Islamic philosophy, had a huge, was used a great deal by the Kalam, by Islamic theology, and a lot of the concepts in the Kalam are very philosophical and would not have arisen without some sort of connection with Greek philosophy or philosophy in general. That's the case in Judaism also. I mean, Jews were really interested in Islamic philosophy. And people sometimes say, well, why were the Arabs interested in philosophy when they came to dominate the classical world and they came across Islamic philosophy? And why were the Jews interested in it when they came upon it? And why were the Christians interested in it? Because there's no reason why they needed to be interested in it. I mean, philosophy doesn't do anything amazingly useful. I mean, you can build bridges and gardens and other things without knowing much Aristotle, or indeed any Aristotle. And I think the answer is because it's interesting. It's interesting. These are interesting ideas. And especially for people with a religious disposition, they explore, examine, analyze concepts which are important for anyone how should we live, should we do, should we believe, how should we act, who should we trust? These are all philosophical questions. Who should our friends be? And philosophers have looked at those issues, Aristotle in particular, so it's quite natural that other people would be interested in them, regardless of their particular religious orientation. Jews had another reason for being interested in philosophy, Islamic philosophy, I suppose, because Islam, it was the hegemonic religion, it was the leading culture of the time in the places that Jews were living in Al-Andalus, and in other parts of the Maghreb and further east. And Jews were very interested also in Arabic, as a language and really liked Arabic. I mean, there are many poems in Hebrew to the beauty of Arabic in the Jewish world. So obviously they became, they wanted to become involved with the current ideas and controversies and issues that were going on in the culture, the leading culture of the world in which they were in. And it was Islamic philosophy often. And they took those ideas and they worked with them and they developed them in a whole variety of different ways. Sometimes they were Aristotelian, sometimes they were anti-Aristotelian, sometimes they were Neoplatonist, sometimes they were anti-Neoplatonist, sometimes they were Averroist, sometimes they were Maimonidean, sometimes they were anti-Maimonidean. So in the Jewish world, philosophy became to be very important, but with one important difference, I think, from the other Jewish areas of intellectual inquiry. Philosophy never had a particularly high status. What had high status in the Jewish world was halacha, was sharia, was law. Law had a very high status. Law was something that Jews of the time, and I'm tempted to say still today, is fascinated by. So legal scholars, law, religious law was something that Jews were very interested in and worked with and had a high status. Philosophy was more marginal. Philosophy was linked with independent thought. Philosophy wasn't really linked with religion. It was linked with abstract thought, pure abstract thought, really. Although it was often given a Jewish sort of slant, but it wasn't the highest status of intellectual activity in the Jewish world. And it seems to me that's true also of Islam, actually. I mean, philosophy in the Islamic world, a lot of the Islamic philosophers, of course, were also legal writers, of course, physicians, other things, politicians, mutakallimun, theologians. The philosophy, I don't know, had an enormous amount of respect on the whole. It was regarded as being slightly too abstract and too out of the normal way of doing things to be acceptable to a lot of people or even understandable to a lot of people. I think that's true in the Jewish world also. It was an activity which people could pursue, did pursue, and people read their books and commented on them. There were many translations, critical works, commentaries on Islamic philosophers in Hebrew and in other languages like Italian and French and so on by Jewish thinkers, and of course in Arabic. But we don't know who read these books. We don't know what people did with them. We don't know how far they promoted the careers of the authors of those books. So I think philosophy in the Jewish world was always sort of slightly marginal. And a very good example of this, I suppose, would be the most important thinker in this period, Moses Maimonides, for whom philosophy was quite a dangerous activity. It was something that he was quite cautious about proposing, like Ibn Rushd himself. Like Ibn Rushd, Maimonides and Ibn Rushd both said, philosophy, it's not really something you should do with everyone. You should be very cautious about how you explain these concepts. People who don't really understand what you're doing are going to not be happy with what you're doing, and you may get into trouble, or they may get into trouble, because they may get the wrong ideas about religion if they don't really understand how philosophy works and what its connection is with religion. So both Maimonides and Ibn Rushd, who of course lived at a pretty similar time, and for a certain period in a pretty similar place, Cordoba. I mean, they had this rather, cautious attitude towards disseminating what they were doing among the wider faith public of their particular religion. And that sort of attitude to philosophy is a specialized area. It's not for everyone. I think came to give it, it curtailed its wide dissemination among the Jewish world, and presumably also in the Islamic world. I would point to one thing about the Jewish world and Islamic philosophy, which I think is important, and its importance hasn't really been sufficiently appreciated. And that's in the movement in the Jewish world, which is often called Jewish Averroism. This was persistent, and it ever since Ibn Rushd, it went on right through to the Renaissance. And what Jewish Averroists were interested in was looking critically at the connection between faith and reason, between religion and philosophy. And that tied in very nicely with the Renaissance and what came after the Renaissance, of course, eventually the Enlightenment. And that led to a very common theme in Jewish cultural thought of, I wouldn't say not being religious, but being aware that religion wasn't the only game in town. And if religion is not the only game in town, you start thinking in ways about yourself and your beliefs, which are quite unmedieval, if you like. And I think that was an attitude which in the Jewish world became quite significant. So I think Jewish Averroism is a movement which came to have huge impact in the Jewish world itself, in preparing the Jews for the Enlightenment and what lay beyond the Enlightenment. Jewish Averroism prepared the Jews to be critical of issues like the creation of the world being a finite event, the afterlife as something which we enjoy as individuals with a body. These are ideas which in Averroism are not really acceptable. But most importantly, Jews became aware in a very strident sort of way that philosophy and religion were in some ways seemed to be competing with each other. I know that both Maimonideans and Averroists have ways of bringing them back into harmony with each other. But once you pull the puzzle apart, as it were, it's quite difficult to reassemble it in quite the same way. So I think that had a big impact. Jews often combined Ibn Rushd with Maimonides. They often thought, in some ways, it reminds me of the way in which some of the early Islamic philosophers like Al-Farabi seem to sometimes identify Aristotle and Plato, who of course are very different thinkers. Maimonides and Averroes are very different thinkers. On the other hand, they're not so different in some ways. So I think Jews were quite creative in the ways in which they linked different thinkers in the Jewish and Islamic world. And Islamic philosophy had a very significant impact on Jewish culture for hundreds and hundreds of years, all the way from the medieval time right up to the end of the Renaissance. Ibn Rushd was constantly translated and retranslated into Jewish languages and constantly written about, as was Maimonides. So Islamic philosophy really put a lot of oomph into Jewish thought. It really got it going. Some people would say it's never really moved in such an exciting direction ever since. And I see I've been talking for 15 minutes, so now is a good time for me to stop talking. And I thank you for your attention. I'm just going off to get a kid now, and I'll be back as soon as I can. Okay, bye.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Well, it's my pleasure now to introduce our next respondent. Faisal Devji is a professor of Indian history within St Antony's College at the University of Oxford. Professor Devji specializes in the intellectual history and political thought of modern South Asia, as well as the emergence of Islam as a global category. Faisal has published extremely widely in these areas, including Landscapes of the Jihad, Militancy, Morality, Modernity with Cornell in 2005, Muslim Zion, Pakistan as a Political Idea with Harvard in 2013, and he co-edited Islam After Liberalism, published by Oxford in 2017. Today, the title of Faisal's response is The Falsafa Project and Research in Islamic Intellectual History. Faisal.
Thank you very much. I have to confess, I'm here somewhat under false pretenses because I'm neither a philosopher nor do I deal with falsafa as a category at all. However, I've been most interested in hearing the presentations so far because, of course, the category and its history are inescapable, even if, like me, you're a modernist. So what I thought I'd do is basically ask and try to address the question of whether falsafa, or if we might call it philosophy, in Islam is only an antiquarian subject, unlike philosophy in the West, that when we speak of falsafa and we speak of Islamic philosophy, we are in fact speaking of a dead project, a dead discipline. Now, that might be an excessive thing to say because recent scholarship, as I'm sure many of you will be aware of, has tried to recover Islamic philosophy, to use that term, in various ways, but it tends to do so, and we have heard about this already in one of the previous presentations, through theology, through, let's say, theosophy, if we can use that term for Irfan, and indeed even through Islamism. So you have classical, philosophical, or falsafa-linked themes that can be recovered by modern scholarship and seen indeed as part of a continuing existing tradition, but not in their earlier name, or not as falsafa, not indeed even as philosophy. There are also ways in which anthropologists in our day, for instance, show how terms and categories, and indeed even ways of thinking that are familiar from medieval past can be recycled in various ways in everyday life, though to call this philosophy might be stretched too far. But I suspect this is because in the scholarship on modern Islam, there tend to be only 3 or 4 actors invoked. Clerics or ulama, mystics or Sufis. I realize, of course, that these are terrible translations. Islamists, also not a particularly good translation, and let's say militants or jihadis. Others, like politicians or people who think about politics, seem to have lost an intellectual tradition. We no longer are in the position where we see the production of mirrors for princes, siyasatnamas, indeed even traditional works of ethics, which could once have been seen as being part of a philosophical corpus that dealt with the political life in general. Though, of course, you now have scholars of medieval Islam who show that these forms of political thought actually continued until quite recently, and in some cases even today. So Negin Yavari, for instance, works on Nizam ul-Mulk, but shows how some of Nizam ul-Mulk's figurations are available in the Islamic Republic of Iran today. For Mughal political thought, you have Asfar Moin, very interesting work. It tends to be a bit more antiquarian on sacred kingship, but he writes about the resonance that these ideas have in our own day, even though they cannot possibly be understood as being part of a tradition of thought in any sense. And Hussein Yilmaz on the Ottoman Empire. Yet, what I want to suggest is there have been really important figures in modern Islam who fall outside this set of, 3 or 4 actors who dominate the scholarship. And the one I'm interested in particular is Muhammad Iqbal, who was indeed a philosopher and possibly the most important philosopher, modern Muslim philosopher. Now, there are others, of course, like Ali Shariati, who might not have taken the title philosopher of themselves, but who did think philosophically. And the interesting thing about figures like Iqbal or Shariati is that though they spend a lot of their time thinking about religion and thinking about law, they don't belong to one of those 3 or 4 categories I mentioned earlier. And their arguments are not metaphysical arguments. They don't take metaphysics either as their premise or as their conclusion. Very often they are philosophical or sociological or historical, and the subordination of philosophy to history and what Nadir was saying in his presentation, sometimes to historicism, becomes very, very important here and becomes a problem as well as an advantage or an opportunity. Now, Iqbal, as I'm sure many of you know, studied with the famous philosopher MacTaggart at Cambridge, at Trinity College. He then went on to Munich, where he studied not with a philosopher, but with an asserologist, I think, the man who then became also the supervisor for Gershom Scholem. And it's very interesting when you think about Iqbal and Gershom Scholem, who didn't know each other, but who had the same supervisor in Munich, and who ended up becoming figures very much like each other. Scholem as, if you will, the great sort of important philosophical thinker of Israel, and Iqbal of Pakistan, thinking about religion, thinking about the mystical especially, and the messianic in philosophical terms. Now, Iqbal, starts off quite traditionally. He's very interested in Hegel, not accidentally given his work with MacTaggart, but also his interest in Bradley. And when he goes to Germany in Goethe, again, nothing could be more banal in some ways. But he moves on very strongly to Nietzsche and to Bergson. Now, interestingly, Heidegger is absent from his work. So Iqbal was both in Cambridge and then in Germany in the very first years of the 20th century. So Heidegger had not yet emerged as the figure he became. But Iqbal dies in 1938, and he betrays no familiarity with Heidegger at all, though his work also questions metaphysics, is arguably post-metaphysical, is very much like Heidegger's, but you see how this also comes through Nietzsche in the sense that just as figures like Nietzsche or Heidegger turn to the pre-Socratics to rethink the tradition of European philosophy, Iqbal too turns not to the pre-Socratics so much, but he turns, and not indeed even to the earlier people whom we might class as Falsafa, Islamic philosophers, but to the later tradition, which he thinks is far more inventive, and in Persia, not in Arabia. So even though much of the work would have been in Arabic. And his task is not just to, on the one hand, is to plumb the depths of Western modernity, a task that his contemporary Gandhi also, of course, tried to accomplish. But Iqbal compares what he does, and this is where Falsafa and its history come in, to what Muslims in medieval times had done precisely with Greek thought. How do you understand the power of Greek thinking? You need to plumb it and to understand it. And the challenge posed by Greek thought in medieval times, in the early days of Islam, Iqbal thought was posed by Western modernity in his own day. But he doesn't see this as a continuous tradition from Greece. Indeed, he understands that if there is a link to that tradition, Muslims have it as much as Christians from Western Europe. But he also does so to chart a different philosophical trajectory, and that's what I want to end with here. His thesis is called The Development of Metaphysics in Persia. It's an interesting work. It's a juvenile work in many ways, but it has many fascinating ideas in it. And what he tries to do, and this goes, this I hope speaks to the presentations that have come earlier, is he locates Islamic thought, the entire tradition of Falsafa, between Zoroaster on the one hand and Baha'u'llah on the other. So the entirety of the Islamic philosophical tradition is, as it were, bookended by Zoroastrianism and Baha'ism, to give these thinkers the name of the movements that came after them. And he argues that what Islam does with the conquest of Persia is it enters into Persia together with Greek thought, that you have on the one hand a religion which is completely dominated by a law, as our previous presenter was arguing, but it had with it elements of Greek philosophy, and together, they interrupt the history of Persian thinking, which in Iqbal's view had reached a kind of impasse, but end up fulfilling the problematic that he argues had defined Persian thought. So now I'm not at all suggesting that anything Iqbal says is historically accurate. That is not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is, how does he think about, as a modern Muslim philosopher, aware of the Falsafa tradition, how does he think about the history of philosophy and Islam for modern times? And what he does is he suggests that while Greek or classical thought was dominated by proportion and balance, later turned into relations between the subject and the object, often becoming highly instrumental. So he links this eventually to the violence of colonial rule. Through the Reformation, he has a long kind of historical narrative. The interesting thing for Persian thought, which also is very much like classical Indian thought in Iqbal's view, is that its problem is not that of subject and object. It's not of proportion or of balancing. It is, in fact, the relationship between light and darkness, going back to Zoroastrianism, for which it is infinity that is the crucial category. So it breaks through the limited the circumscribed limits, as he would have it, of classical thought. And so he would like to see the originality of Islamic philosophy. On the one hand, it's not original at all. It simply serves as a medium, an intervention that allows for the fulfillment of the problematic of Persian and also Indian thought. On the other hand, it is innovative because it is anti-classical, he argues, in its emphasis on infinity. And you can see how this way of thinking might link back to Iqbal's valorization of figures like Nietzsche and Bergson. Now, what has he done when he makes this kind of argument that may not have any historical veracity to it? I think what he's done is completely and deliberately mixed up the kinds of clear-cut and singular genealogies that we often deploy to make sense of philosophical traditions. instead of counterposing Greece and Persia, this goes back to our first presentation, he makes Greek thought instrumental in the fulfillment of Persian thought. Instead of seeing Islamic thought as an inheritance of Greek thought, he sees it also as the heir of Persian thought and its apotheosis almost, especially in its later variants, the Ishraqi philosophy of Sohrawardi and Mullah Sadra, etc. Indeed, he's one of the first writers in a European language to bring forward figures like Mullah Sadra and Sohrawardi to a Western audience. And his thesis was published in London, I think, in 1905 or 1906. So there's a completely mixed up genealogy here, and yet this is not an account which is simply muddled up or which is a pantheistic, pantheistic is the wrong word, which is simply about universal agreement. Everything is much the same. He's making very strong distinctions between classical thought and Persian thought, between proportionality and infinity. And yet he's doing so by linking all of these things together. I'd like to suggest in closing that one of the things Iqbal says very often is thinking or philosophy makes the world kin, makes men kin. That it is only thought that allows us to relate to each other. It is not doctrine, it is not ethnographic similarities, it is not similar beliefs necessarily, it is not living in the same place. And what Iqbal does through his career, he has a political career as much as an intellectual career, is to try to abstract political and sociological and other forms of relationship and distinctions into intellectual and I would argue philosophical ones, because only when they become objects of thought, or better, subjects of thought, can everyone relate to them. And that anyone can think a thought and engage with the thought, whether they agree with it or not. And it is this which makes kinship possible. But for that kinship to be possible, you also need to have difference, that ideas must be different. And it is there that philosophy has its meaning for Iqbal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faisal. So next, it's my pleasure to introduce Georges Tamer, who holds the Chair of Oriental Philology and Islamic Studies at the Friedrich Alexander University Erlangen-Nuremberg. And in 2020, he founded the Bavarian Research Center for Interreligious Discourses there. His main research areas include the hermeneutics of the Quran, Islamic philosophy and theology, medieval Arabic literature, and Jewish Christian Islamic discourses. He boasts an extraordinary publication history, including Islamic Philosophy and the Crisis of Modernity, published by Brill in 2001, and translated for SUNY Press this year, I think. Time and God, Hellenistic Conceptions of Time in Ancient Arabic Poetry and in the Quran with de Gruyter in 2008. And he co-edited The Concept of Human Rights in Judaism, Christianity and Islam, which was published by de Gruyter in 2022. His response today is titled The Falsafa Project in Between Jewish, Christian, Islamic Discourses. Georges.
Thank you. As I said before, I'm afraid I won't be able to talk and to say more than 2 sentences, and I will start coughing again. So Nadir, would you be kind, sure, and you are kind enough to lend me your voice?
My pleasure indeed. I have the text.
Thank you.
The Falsafa Project in Between Jewish, Christian, Islamic Discourses. The secularization process that began in the modern era claimed to banish religion from the public to the private sphere. As is well known, this did not happen as radically as once thought. Even in secularized societies, religions have not lost their public influence. On the contrary, even before the end of the last century, a strong return of religion to the public sphere was diagnosed. Indeed, this return can be demonstrated by a broad spectrum of highly visible phenomena, ranging from the growth of religious spiritual movements with political influence at the ballot box at the latest, to the increasing observance of religious dress codes in public and militant struggles in the name of religion. Such developments, and especially the jihadist attacks of September 11, 2001, in the heart of the United States, led Jürgen Habermas to describe contemporary society as post-secular and to give religion a firm place in it. Today's most renowned exponent of the critical theory has recently gone one step further in recognizing the intellectual historical position of religion in Europe. In his monumental late work, Auch eine Geschichte der Philosophie, he describes the entire history of Western philosophy as a discursive constellation of faith and knowledge. From the tension between the two poles of Jerusalem and Athens, religion and philosophy, emerges the spiritual force that sustains European civilization, as Habermas now sees it. He thus concedes that religion has a constructive function in the history of philosophy because of its capacity for discourse, from his account of the history of philosophy. The fruitful exchange between Jerusalem and Athens also took place between Mecca and Baghdad and between Mecca and Cordoba between the 9th and 13th centuries. Not only Muslim, but also Christian and Jewish thinkers participated in its formation, making the tense relationship between reason and revelation a relevant theme of their synthetic philosophizing in Arabic. I believe this densely written page of intellectual history can be unfolded in the Falsafa project. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are linked by profound commonalities that have developed over the centuries and that can be seen not only in the areas of theology, liturgy, exegesis, art, religious practice, and jurisprudence in each of these religions, but also in the area of philosophy of religion. It should come as no surprise that these religions are deeply related to each other, since their genesis and early development took place successively and mostly in mutual exchange within a relatively easily definable spatial context. As a result, a familial relationship has developed between them. Thus, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam exhibit broadly anchored interrelationships, both in terms of the God-human relationship and in terms of the ethical norms and eschatological ideas that result from it. Their visible common features, together with the semantic interpretations associated with them in each of the three religions, often give the impression that they are very similar to each other. Both the similarities and the differences between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam play an important role in shaping the relations between the religious communities and are used in the respective context depending on the orientation of the current actors. Thus, it is primarily the differences that are at the center of interreligious polemics and apologetics, while the similarities are of particular relevance for any efforts at inter-religious rapprochement. Yes, the three monotheistic religions and their various offshoots are complex, historically evolved discourses. Their discursiveness is multifaceted and will continue as long as they exist. Both discourses between different positions within the same tradition, as well as dealing with the ideas of another tradition, the other, which is accepted in a modified form or rejected through argumentation. These are essential elements of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. With respect to that, discursivity is not only a religious historical category that can be used to describe their development, but rather an epistemic tool that must be used when it comes to gaining an adequate, objective, and comprehensive understanding of the nature and central component of each of these religions, past and present. With the emergence of the Quran, the Arabic language became the medium of communal communication in which the holy scriptures of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam existed and were transmitted. The scriptures were used in Arabic in polemical and apologetic discourses. But not only that, they also became the subject of philosophical reflection, especially when it came to interpreting seemingly irrational statements in the Quran metaphorically in order to resolve the contradiction between revelation and reason. While this approach was first introduced by the rational theologians of the Mu'tazila, it was further developed by Al-Ghazali, who shaped a Quranic hermeneutical canon that was critically purified of Sufi elements by Ibn Rushd and brought closer to Aristotle and further rationalized. His Quranic hermeneutical principles were applied to the philosophical treatment of biblical passages in Arabic by his younger compatriot Musa ibn Maymun, influenced by his predecessors, the Falsafa. Maimonides dealt critically with the Mutakallim. The Falsafa project can shed light on these fruitful discourses on the Holy Scriptures. Al-Farabi has already provided the systematic impetus for such an endeavor. In his book, Al-Jama' Bayna Ra'yay Hakimain, he attributes to philosophy the ability to resolve religious conflicts within the religious community. In his view, philosophy creates a rational neutral ground on which the conflicting parties can meet. Al-Farabi's philosophical project aims at harmonization, ultimately presenting a unified philosophy for a unified community to be led by a first chief, Al-Ra'is al-Awwal, and designed as a harmonious whole. In his book, في الواحد والوحدة, he justifies the absolute unity of God in an Aristotelian manner. Presumably his attempt inspired his disciple, Yahya ibn Adi, to articulate his belief in the triune God using Aristotelian and Neoplatonic terminology. His covertly theological, metaphysical Maqala fi Tawheed, treatise on divine unity or monotheism, is an attempt to use philosophy to explain to his Muslim interlocutors how Christians understand the Trinity as one God. In Ibn Adi's view, and in that he is part of the Arab Falsafa tradition, philosophy is particularly suited to establishing productive discourses between the different religions and leading them along paths of reason for the purpose of mutual understanding. For this reason alone, the current Falsafa project is worthwhile.
Thank you, Georges, and thank you,
Thank
Nader.
you, Georges. Thank you.
Thank you, Nader.
And next up, I'm delighted to introduce Kata Moser. Kata is a junior professor for secularism in the Islamic modernity at the University of Göttingen, a position she has held since 2019. Professor Moser's research interests revolve primarily around contemporary Arabic philosophy and history of ideas, Arabic discourses and theories of secularism, the Arabic philosophy of religion and metaphysics, and the Arabic reception of Martin Heidegger. Kata has published widely in these areas, including her book, Academic Philosophy in the Arabic World, published with Klaus Schwartz in 2018, and she co-edited Heidegger in the Islamic World with Roman and Littlefield in 2021. Today, Kata's response is titled The Falsafa Project and Contemporary Arabic Philosophy with its Modern European Sources. Kata.
Thank you very much. And thank you also, Nader Al-Bizri, for the invitation to be part of this. It is really exciting because I think the Falsafa project is, from the point of view of contemporary Arabic philosophy, indeed very, very fruitful and a helpful perspective for the field as such. In my response, my comment, I would like to present two aspects, one from a more systematic perspective and the other more historic, about the connection between the Falsafa project and contemporary Arabic philosophy. And I would like to pose two questions to the Falsafa project from the point of view of contemporary Arabic philosophy. Maybe I just want to start with a small remark on the term Falsafa. Oliver Leaman is not there now, but from the contemporary position, Falsafa, of course, is the term for philosophy. So it does not seem strange at all using this term, and it also does not feel strange to use the term falsafa also retrospectively to denominate all kinds of thinking, thought that would be labeled from today's perspective as philosophy, but maybe at the time of thinking would use different terms from falsafa. So this is the contemporary response to falsafa. Yeah, I would like to start with some general characteristics of contemporary Arabic philosophy, namely the standard narration about this philosophy. Standard narration says that contemporary Arabic philosophy is embedded, is of course part of a very complex web of traditions, but two of these traditions have always been regarded dominant, and they are, on one hand, the classical Arabo-Islamic philosophy, and on the other hand, modern and contemporary Western philosophy. So, and this Western philosophy is the European philosophy at the beginning of the 19th century, with increasingly bigger importance of American philosophy as well. The Falsafa project is connecting these two traditions, and actually also contemporary Arab philosophy is in a way connecting these two. So the Falsafa project and contemporary Arabic philosophy both act in a way as a bridge between the two traditions. They are trying to bridge them, and the bridge, of course, is a powerful image of building a connection between two entities. And the question, of course, is what kind of a bridge is it? Within contemporary Arabic philosophy, and due to the fact of the presence of these two traditions I was just naming, a third tradition emerged, which is the harmonization between classical Arabic Islamic philosophy and modern and contemporary Western philosophy. So in contemporary Arabic philosophy, the bridge would be this harmonization. But the question still, the open question is still, what connection are we actually talking about here? I would like to come to the historical perspective. And here too, I start with the standard narrative. The standard narration about contemporary Arabic philosophy knows three distinct phases of the development of Arabic philosophy as such. The first phase is the flourishing of Arabo-Islamic philosophy in the 10th to the 12th centuries, with the big names. We heard many of them, most importantly, Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd. And this phase ends approximately in the 12th century and is followed by a second phase, which is again, and still in the standard narration, the disappearance of Arabo-Islamic philosophy after Ibn Rushd, or for some even a bit later, after Ibn Khaldun. So after this disappearance, what is left behind is a philosophical wasteland in the Arab world, a philosophical wasteland that has been described also quite recently by Ahmad Barqawi, philosopher from Syria, in a book that is called Al-Arab wa Audat al-Falsafa, so Arabs and the Return of Philosophy. And he says that the disappearance of philosophy was complete. So it was absolute in the 13th century. There was no more occupation with philosophy. Reason, aql, vanished, civilization declined, and theology took its place. And this is now Barqawi speaking, but it is very much part of a standard narrative still present about when talking about Arabic philosophy from the point of view of contemporary Arabic philosophy. So after the disappearance, the third phase in this standard narration would be the return of philosophy to the Arab world since the encounter with Western countries, and this is located more or less end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. This narration of philosophy with a big gap between the classical age and the modern age is present in historiographies, for example, by Majid Fakhri. His history of Islamic philosophy ends with Ibn Khaldun for the classical time, and then there's a gap, and he restarts with Al-Afghani and Muhammad Abdu at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Talking about this return, the question is, of course, what is that philosophy that is coming back? So what kind of a philosophy is coming back to the Arab world after it departed? Is it the same philosophy that just went on a walk and comes back, or is it something else that arrives in the Arab world? To come back once again to Barqawi, he says on this subject, when philosophy returned, it was thought that what came back was the other in the appearance of philosophy. Philosophy returned in the new costume from Descartes to Monnier. Some saw in this return only a westernization. Not our philosophy returned, but theirs. So the modern Western philosophy is seen as the other, as unrecognizable. And when contemporary Arabic philosophy is reading or receiving Western philosophy, an authenticity problem is, of course, involved, because the Western philosophy is not longer recognized as part of a tradition. The Arab world would be part of it, but it is seen as an alien philosophy, something alien to the Arab world. With the Falsafa project, that is with its focus on the impact of Arabic Islamic philosophy on Europe, this narrative, I believe, could be changed, could be challenged at least, and contemporary Arabic and Western philosophy could maybe be transformed into something like the prodigal daughter that went missing but returned to the place she came from, and not something alien that has never been there. The Falsafa project, by highlighting the indebtedness to Arab Islamic philosophy, can write against the alleged inauthenticity of Western philosophy in contemporary Arabic philosophy. So now I would like to come to my two questions that I would like to ask to the Falsafa project. The first question is, what does it actually mean that Arabic and Islamic thought has an intellectual history in Europe? What does it leave behind in the Arab Islamic world? So we were talking about the metaphor of disappearance, of the migration of philosophy away from the Arab world. Of course, beside the metaphor, the picture of migration, one could also use other pictures like ruins, leftovers, remains. And in fact, the research on the post-classical philosophy shows that this post-classical time is very productive also in her own way. So absence is not exactly accurate from the research perspective. And there are books, commentaries to old books, new books appearing, institutes of higher learning. And the question is, of course, what are these other places of philosophy outside the places where we would usually look at? And what are the other names of philosophy outside of the names like Falsafa that we would usually look for? And the question then, of course, related to the Falsafa project would be, how did this continuous philosophical tradition in the Arab world have an intellectual history in Europe too? So not only the classical Falsafa, but also what came after. And for today's contemporary Arabic philosophy, the benefit to establish such a perspective would be, of course, to show contemporary Arabic philosophy as a living tradition and not as something that suffered from a rupture and was reinvented, but as something that had a continuous living. My second question to the Falsafa project is, what does it mean that Europe received Arabic and Islamic thought and was impacted by it? Is it a one-time crossing, or are we talking here about some kind of a relationship? Because if we posit that philosophy kept on living in the Arabo-Islamic world, we also need to be open to the possibility that there is a continuous exchange between Arabic philosophy and European philosophy. Mobility sure was not as widespread or in this form as we know it today, but also regions were not hermetically sealed off from each other. So how to think about this connection? Is it a kind of a encounter? In what way? In what form? What does it mean for philosophy? Is it do we have to think about some kind of a friendly relationship maybe, or as a network of multiple connections, or how do we think about it? And for contemporary Arabic philosophy, this perspective would be especially helpful to get over the picture that modern philosophy is a kind of a hostile takeover, a hegemonic endeavor to gain the power in the world via philosophy. Because, and that's also a trend in recent research looking at the pre-modern area, philosophy, Arab philosophers were always very creatively adapting thought from all kind of regions, including the European region. So looking at the continuity in the encounter could also help to get a different perspective on later contacts during the imperial time. So all in all, I think to tackle these questions in the Falsafa project would be of great benefit for contemporary Arabic philosophy, for the understanding of its history and also historiography, for the narrative about itself, for its self-esteem, and also for its self-awareness on a broader scale. To raise awareness of various stages, places, and modes of modern and contemporary Arabic philosophy and its mutual influences or exchanges with European philosophy is, I think, crucial to understand this philosophy better. And of course, this would not be in order to flatten out differences, but rather to value various contributions to philosophy as valid philosophical reflections on pressing questions of the age. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kata. Well, we now have roughly 45 minutes for a group discussion, and Kata has very fruitfully concluded the session with 2 questions. So I wonder if we could initiate the discussion then with Nadia and Lawrence in response to those questions.
Kata, thank you very much indeed. I mean, I think these are really important questions. I mean, your first question, what does it actually mean that there is an intellectual history in Europe for Falsafa? I would simply say that of course, my underhand move was to redraw the borders of Europe. In other words, to say that the intellectual history in Europe is identical with the intellectual history of Falsafa, because I used an understanding of Europe that would be familiar in antiquity, but not familiar in the present day. This seems to me an extremely important thing to do. And I suppose, I mean, I'm therefore using Europe in an extremely loose way. The way in which I would point towards, or the way in which I would point towards how to destabilize this would be to say that one should not forget that the word Maghreb means Abend, means evening, the evening land. Abendland, which, as you will know, is a familiar category in at least Heidegger's philosophy. I certainly wouldn't want to use it in the Spenglerian sense. But Heidegger clearly wanted to draw our attention to physical orientation. And that's why I mentioned the work of the geographers. So I very much like, for instance, Halford Mackinder's understanding of a Europe that is divided. And it's divided across a line that runs from the mouth of the Nile, as it were, and down. But we draw that line beginning at the mouth of the Nile, running up the Adriatic, and in a line that therefore puts Scandinavia actually more on the eastern side of Europe than it does on the west. And that eastern side stretches right across to the Caucasus, right across to include ancient Colchis, but actually modern day Georgia and even Azerbaijan. And so to take the Caspian Sea almost as the westernmost limit. And the southernmost limit, therefore, would be the whole of sub-Saharan, of super-Saharan Africa. So stretching, therefore, on the one hand, from the Maghreb, from the Western Isles, where I'm an inhabitant, the ice rim, as Mackinder calls it. This is a much broader concept of Europe, but the isolation, as it were, of this intellectual tradition from its co-traditionalists prevents us, by a modern concept of Europe that excludes, for instance, the Levant or Syria or Iraq, prevents us from seeing the genuine movement of ideas that takes place. And that brings me, to your second point. What do we mean by continuous exchange? I was fascinated by Oliver's question, which is, why were Jews, Muslims, and Christians interested in philosophy? This is a question that beset me when I was working 20 years ago on Aquinas, because Aquinas is continually raising the question of the significance of Aristotle in relation to what he himself is trying to do. Now, it seems to me he's doing that for two reasons. One, for a certain intellectual validity. I used to, when I was at one time in the seminary, used to ask the question, what did it mean that Aquinas wrote a Summa contra Gentiles? Who were these Gentiles? And everybody shrugged their shoulders and said, well, Gentiles just means peoples. It was, well, of course, it's not the peoples at all. This was the Arab Islamic philosophy. The Summa contra Gentiles was the response, the answers to the questions posed by the Islamic philosophers, by Maimonides, and so forth. Why were Jews, Muslims, and Christians interested in philosophy? And that's why I chose as the subject of my paper the question of truth. Because the question of where truth resides and how it is made manifest was absolutely crucial in each of these traditions. And it repeats itself over and over again in Aquinas's deliberations. There is the undelivered part of my paper is an examination of Aquinas's claim that the original formulation of the modern understanding of truth belongs to Isaac ben Solomon, Israeli, the Jewish scholar Alexandrian scholar of the Islamicate, who lives, well, we're not quite sure, but somewhere between 950 and 1050. Muckle, who edited the first critical edition of Isaac's definitions, could not find the definition that Aquinas says not once but twice is present in Isaac's work when he edited them. So he shrugs his shoulders, and the presumption is that Aquinas makes a mistake. And Pouillon, who writes on this about 4 or 5 years later, so Muckle wrote in I think he published in 1933, and Pouillon replied in 1939 to say, well, it's a mistake because the real formula is to be found in Avicenna. There is a connection as well, a well-established connection between Isaac's work and that of Avicenna. But if you go back to the definitions, and there's a more recent edition of the critical edition of Isaac's work in English translation, actually both of Parmenides' definitions are present. They're not present, it's correct, in the formula. But my suspicion is that the formula was a reminiscence or a recollection of what was taught that was common in consequence of Isaac's understanding of truth. So here you have the same understanding of truth being articulated, the same definition of truth being articulated by a Jew, by a Muslim, and by a Christian. Now, there's a very, very great deal that could be said about that, but it seems to me extremely important that that is investigated, that that is examined. There is I have a drive myself to finish the paper in that way. So in other words, not therefore to isolate out of this simply historical traditions, but rather to isolate out of this the genuine philosophical questions, which present themselves both for those at the roots of Falsafa, and I know I'm going on long, so I will shut up in just a second, but because what intrigues me is that Falsafa represents the transition of Greek ideas from the Eastern wing of this much wider concept of Europe that I had suggested to the Western wing. In other words, for the first time, a project of this kind allows us to bring into relief the Western European contribution to the history of metaphysics itself. This, it seems to me, is absolutely crucial because it's something much neglected in my own experience of the treatment of the history of the development of philosophical ideas in the so-called West. In other words, I want to break the idea that there was somehow a road or a flight path directly from, let's say, Athens to the University of Paris or the University of Oxford or the University of Bologna in around about a bit somewhere between 1180 and 1205. I want to break that idea because in fact it's a spiral, and it's a spiral that we don't fully understand because it's a spiral without doubt that penetrates right up into Central Asia. If Christopher Beckwith is correct, the curricula for those three universities, those three Western universities, Oxford, Paris, and Bologna, that were all founded by Crusaders, came from Levantine madrasas. But the curricula themselves in those Levantine madrasas, if Beckwith is correct, were derived from Buddhist viharas in Central Asia in a way that we don't even yet understand. So to understand, therefore, these transitions and transmissions in straight lines would be the most foolish of mistakes. And yet what is central to them is the fundamental Parmenidean question, if you like, which is how are we to understand the ongoing unfolding of aletheia, of, if you want to translate aletheia with truth, of the disclosure of what is such that it is, that permeates the whole of the speculation and speculative thought, the thoughtful thought of this region of Europe, which I have blown the borders open on. That would be my response to your question. In other words, it's not at all to accept the modern confines in order to throw open the windows to examine the wider questions that are thrown up by the historical phenomenon, the occurring of the phenomena of the transmission of these ideas over 26 centuries. So I hope that that's an adequate, at least springboard for the beginning of this project for, with luck, we hope, then at least the next 8 years. You are muted, Aaron.
Nadia, did you want to add anything?
Yes, actually, I think we're just beginning to brainstorm over the project, and already I see lots of possibilities for exchange of ideas with our four distinguished discussants. But maybe I return to Kata and then try to link with what we encountered with Oliver, Georges, and Faisal. I stressed, for instance, not in the same way that was articulated perhaps by Lawrence, but on a more restricted kind of geographical thinking. I talked about Miletus, right? Pre-Socratic, source also of philosophy. And then the role of the Hellenistic diaspora, schools in Alexandria or Antioch, or the saturation of the tradition also in Harran. And at the same time, evoking the Roman world. The Roman world, yes, it stretches up to Hadrian's Wall, but ultimately major centers of that world were in the Levant, in African, Roman Africa, in Algeria and Syria. So these traditions are the ones that ultimately are underpinning late antiquity. So the coming of Islam to the Levant and ultimately across Egypt and North Africa to Andalus is coming into a land that has sustained this body of knowledge in different forms, and is not something detached from the indigenous inhabitants of these lands. And in particular, I focused on the Levant and on Egypt. So that's from one perspective, if we're looking at it in terms of the geographies, or reflecting on this kind of divide, east and west, around the Mediterranean basin, and particularly the Eastern Mediterranean. Then the issue that relates to the transmission, reception, assimilation, it's not a whole one move. We know that different texts have their own trajectories, their own genealogy of reception, adaptation, turned from even translation of Latin, as we encountered, into the Vulgare, into French versions, or versions in Italian. So the relationship of the evolution of the texts, of the concepts continued, and the concepts themselves, when we are dealing with even figures like Descartes, Kant and Hegel, how much have they in general surpassed the Greek corpus, and in what way have they overcome the evolution of concepts that we find through the development of European thought in the medieval period and the Renaissance? Especially if we take the exact sciences. For instance, the treatise of Dioptrique of Descartes, if I compare it to the versions in Latin of Ibn al-Haytham's Dioptrique, Descartes look like a kind of very basic text in terms of dealing with the complexities of the geometry that is required in that discipline. And this is recognized ultimately beyond the age of Ibn al-Haytham by Hevelius. So we see Hevelius looking at Ibn al-Haytham as the foundation of his science, alongside Galileo, who is relying also on instruments. And this is on the frontispiece of a treatise on studying the moon, Selenographia. So these are just examples of the way the texts and concepts and their reception evolved in the European milieu. And this doesn't mean that there wasn't any kind of relationship. Actually, I find what you said very illuminating, and I agree with it, that it is a continuing relationship, but it's not of the same level of visibility and impact that we see it with figures like Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina, Ibn al-Haytham, Avenpas. So that's one aspect. Now, for the post-classical period, yes, definitely, I don't agree with the with the perspective that places, maybe even Ibn Khaldun as one of the last amongst the lineage of those who we could think of them as being hukama or falasifa, or those who place it, from the time Ghazali onwards, even with the attempt of Ibn Rushd to resalvage the philosophical tradition, it already was dealt a blow that it couldn't recover from. This is evidently lots of studies and the recent scholarship are showing that this reading is inaccurate. And Faisal mentioned some very notable traditions that evolve, whether with the lineage of Sohrawardi, Mullah Sardra, Mir Damad, that we find in the Persian world, or the development of an interest quite amazing with dealing with Copernicus, for instance, like the figure of Mir Muhammad Hussein Londoni, end of the 18th century, already, arguing with his contemporaries using the Arabic language to advocate this new conception of the cosmos based on the Copernican model. So the exchanges are happening, but I'm no longer, the medium of the Arabic language is there, but it's no longer mainly happening from the territories that would have been historically dominated by an Arabic culture. Now it gravitates more towards India, Persia, and the Ottoman realm, the Ottoman territories. So there are continuations, and as you said, the re-encounter happens with the generation also of Rafa' al-Tahtawi, Muhammad Abdu al-Afghani. And I find it very odd, for instance, like for Rafa' al-Tahtawi, he's so mesmerized by the curricula that he finds in France, in the universities. And when he lists them, they are not different from what we find in Ihsa al-Ulum al-Farabi and what we find in the Fahrist of Rasail Ikhwan al-Safa. And it feels, that there is a kind of distancing from that tradition that is occurring in the milieu in which figures like Tahtawi are being formed intellectually. But the focus mainly in the Falsafa project is on philosophical concepts and questions, without going outside the bounds of what is archivable and documented in terms of lines of transmission. So we're balancing between, honoring the scholarship that is based on historiography, philology, studies that are well documented in terms of lines and channels of transmission, but also the concepts themselves have their own way of unfolding. And it is that we will also account for. Now, for the renewal and an endeavor of dealing with and the use of the term falsafa to designate it as something that is coming from the region of the Arabic language in dealing with philosophy, grosso modo, is emphasizing that ultimately this is a grounding of a tradition that has multiple schools and legacies that underpinned it. And Barqawi is a friend of mine. I interact with him, right? So, but he belongs to a different generation that looks at what is coming now from the European tradition as being detached from what is ultimately a heritage of Arabic or Islamic philosophy. Which to my mind is what I'm trying to question in various forms. And the same, you recall when thinking about Heidegger and the Arabic traditions and philosophy, it comes part and parcel of Heidegger's critique of classical ontology. And there is a mention of Ibn Sina in that context. So seeing a kind of response to Heidegger from the standpoint of looking at the Islamicate philosophical tradition and Avicennism in particular can be a way also of developing concepts in modern form of ontology that engages philosophers who take Avicennism seriously as a legacy, engage them with direct discourse with modern philosophers. All of us most likely marginalized by the dominance of the analytic tradition, which we know that, but this is changing, and there are avenues in which we could widen the spectrum of discussions. So this is, in general, my response. But also for Oliver, yes, hikmah is very, very important. But our also dalil is tahafut al-falasifa. So he went after them as technical, philosophers, yet to be criticized and to be called into question. But he didn't refer to them as hukama, because of the nature of the term can exceed the bounds of the technical, abstract systematic form of a particular tradition in philosophy that we refer to as falsafa. So this is, in general, some of the responses. And just lastly, with George, there are intersections, somehow I see them, of the Falsafa project with the key concepts series, which is trying to look at notions and philosophical concepts across various traditions, Islamic, Jewish, and Christian. And it is an attempt to go beyond the dominance of the culturally motivated interreligious dialogue. Thank you.
Richard has asked a very interesting question in the chat, and I wonder if I could ask Richard Taylor to repose the question for the group.
I think Nader addressed the question quite clearly, but I really want to ask Kata about this because of the account of what people who work in contemporary Arabic philosophy think about their past history. And so the question, Nader was responding to the same thing as well. But in particular, I find that those who have studied Arabic Islamic philosophy intensely, such as Dimitri Gutas and all his work on Ibn Sina, and others as well. I'm thinking of Rob Wisnowski at Institute of Islamic Studies at the Islamic Institute in Montreal, I think it is, and their work in revealing a continuous tradition of the study of philosophy, particularly in the Abyssinian tradition, that goes right into, and of course has been very, very powerful, really developed in Iran and elsewhere. And Nader, you also mentioned Ottoman Turkey as well. Of course, in Turkey, every time they open a new university, they must include a theology department which has a philosophy subdivision. So the study of philosophy is very strong there, but also in Iran, it's truly vibrant in Iran as well. So, Kata, my question is: do the people working in contemporary Arabic philosophy need to be, in some sense, corrected when they talk about this? What I've seen talked about in other ways is this really Orientalist kind of vision that there was no real philosophy after Ibn Rushd or Averroes comes through, which, I've always thought to be silly, but about if you could comment on that. I mean, are they misunderstanding it, and certainly you're well in touch with contemporary views. So I appreciate anything you might have to say on this.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, from the point of view of contemporary Arabic philosophy, as Nader already said, it is a view, a standard narrative that has been present a lot in the past, and one finds it still quite strongly also in areas outside philosophy. Like in the public sphere, it is one of the main points that, well, we don't have philosophy here. What are you talking about? It's maximum we do readings of European philosophers, but it's not philosophy. So it's publicly still a very widely circulated idea. But among philosophers, this is not the case any longer. And the contemporary philosophers or the researchers in the history of contemporary philosophy are trying to offer different narratives by going back into the past, like from the more contemporary times, to trace the history of concepts, of ideas, of by going back to the archives and see clearly like what was actually translated, how was it understood, what happened in the process of translation. Because in the early modern or even the pre-modern times, European texts circulated in abbreviated forms or in translations, and they have been dealt with very creatively. And the modern or the contemporary tendency in this research goes in a direction to not just see it as a passive impact that came from Europe and initiated some kind of a new philosophy, but to see it as a genuinely creative act to find answers to pressing present questions. And these answers would be then based on the reading of Rousseau, on the reading of Descartes, or on other philosophers or texts available. So no, this philosophical wasteland, I think it's overcome in the research, and it is tackled from the contemporary side by getting more clearness about what exactly happened in philosophical circles or in philosophical thought, and coming more from the classical time. The post-classical time is getting more and more important and is studied also in order to see the developments after Falsafa, or the traditions that are that are somehow existing beside and with Falsafa, and that can be called philosophy.
Thank you. I think it's really important for the Falsafa project that this whole idea of the death of philosophy, and certainly the ending of philosophy with Averroes, let us say, that certainly is an Orientalist notion, because everything after the Orientalist part is everything after that is mystical and mysterious, and of course, was just a complete waste of intellectual energy to say such things. I guess more. May I ask a more general question regarding the project?
Yes, please do.
Sort of asking. Okay, my question is this, which maybe it's too obvious a question, but the elephant in the room didn't say a word, and that is the massive. Nothing was discussed about the details and importance of this massive translation movement in Sicily and across not just Toledo, but mainly Toledo, but many other places in Andalusia or Spain, modern day Spain. And I mean, that seems to be the motivator behind all the material that came through, all the ideas that came through, the motivator behind part of the Falsafa project, and pushing an understanding of how Europe received this material, how important it was to Europe, and yet it's not discussed. It's not been discussed.
Actually, Richard, I mentioned it. I mentioned the Andalusian circle of transmission translation. I mentioned Sicily. I mentioned Crusades, and Lawrence mentioned the Crusades also, and Byzantium, the interaction with Byzantine lands. So very important, very fundamental. Absolutely.
Well, I guess what I have in mind is that there was a massive surge of translations, and those translations and other works, while initially barred at supposedly not allowed at Paris and elsewhere, were absolutely over. The interest on the intellectuals, the theologians, and those of a philosophical bent was so great that it just absolutely overran all those prohibitions and became essential in many, many ways. So, I mean, I think that needs to be brought out in its detail because it's so penetrating. Just to give one example, one of the discussions that's going on nowadays is the discussions of the term intention and intentionality. and the claims made that, in fact, when Brentano talks about this sort of thing, he's actually reaching back into something that's already found in maybe Aquinas and in Ibn Sina and others. And then some historians say, absolutely not. The notion of matna is not the same as intentio along the lines of Brentano. But that's an instance of notions that need to be considered in detail, and for some, are part of a real penetration into European thought. And certainly, I mean, in metaphysics, Aquinas and Albert and others absolutely depend upon Ibn Sina, and in understanding physics and much more. And metaphysics, they depend upon Ibn Rushd. It's all required reading, this sort of thing. Behind it all, in the beginnings in the 12th century, early translations of Al-Farabi, the enumeration of the sciences, because the Latins didn't know how to structure all this sort of thing. So all those structures are passed through and become foundational in later thinking in massive ways. So I guess I want to urge more consideration of more detail on some of that.
Can I come in on that? I mean, I think there's a herd of elephants, as it were, to be to be fed and watered on this. I mean, not only issues of translation. I mean, a key figure here who crops up on every side is Averroes, because the development of Latin Averroism and the reaction to it is still not understood, it seems to me. And it seems to me that rush that you describe, which is the consequence of that influx of those translations and of the, as it were, the para-official consideration of Greek texts and their interpretation, but mediated through the Arab tradition, clearly unnerves the authorities. I mean, it leads to the condemnations of 1270 and 1277. I've yet to see a serious investigation or consideration of what it was that they were so frightened by, as it were. The whole voluntarist debate within Western Christianity seems to me to be driven by something from beyond, and not from within Christianity itself. And by Christianity here, we're speaking only of Latin Christianity, since this is not reflected in any way in any of the forms of Eastern Christianity. So there are, I think, the reason why the elephant wasn't mentioned, and I mean, I did mention, by the way, the Sicilian Emirate, and I did mention the situation in the Iberian Peninsula, the Caliphate in the Iberian Peninsula. The reason why these things are not mentioned is we just didn't have enough time. But you're absolutely right to turn our focus to them, and I think that they are key moments in the developments of Falsafa. So if you take, for instance, the figure of Duns Scotus, I mean, when I was a graduate student in Cambridge, Duns Scotus in the divinity faculty was being erected as the bogeyman, the bad man, as it were, the man who plunges Christianity into metaphysical confusion. This is a nonsense, of course. I mean, this argument doesn't stand up to any serious consideration. But someone like Helen Lang, who also worked very carefully on, as she calls it, in her little book, Aristotle and his medieval it's Aristotle and his medieval varieties. She does consider the way in which Duns Scotus was shaped by, or Duns Scotus' work was shaped by the condemnations of 1277. So if those condemnations are to a certain extent driven by questions outside Christianity, and my suspicion is that they are accusations coming, I strongly suspect, from the Islamic world to Christian, to their Christian connections. What that means is you have a moment there in Christianity where Islam is having a major impact on the development of at least the Christian intellectual tradition. Now, I don't mean Christianity as a religion. I mean it as an intellectual tradition, because the intellectual tradition, the tradition of Christendom, in Western Christianity drives the history of this whole region. So this is one of those places that I would like the Falsafa project to illuminate, to throw light on, because I don't think that light has ever been satisfactorily, at least for my own instincts, thrown on why these developments unfolded in the way that they did. And I know that this is an area very much of interest to you, Richard. So, I mean, I think these things are crucial. I have never seen satisfactory explanations of what it was. It was always explained to me as a Catholic within the sort of Catholic intellectual milieu as a rivalry between the Franciscans and the Dominicans. Oh, the Franciscans were all about voluntarism and the will, and the Dominicans were all. This is trivial. This is childish. There must have been something much, just because Tempier, who was then the Bishop of Paris, happened to be a Franciscan, and he was out to get the Dominican Aquinas and his and Albert the Great lying in the background. This cannot possibly be as simple or as trivial as some row between people who wear different colored habits. That makes no sense. I wondered.
I've been involved in some. Oh, go ahead.
No, go on. No, sorry. If you wanted to.
Well, I was going to say I've been involved in conversations with colleagues who work in Scotus and Bonaventure and Albert and Aquinas as well. And the contentions, the differences between them are that Bonaventure and Scotus and others really drew heavily upon Ibn Sina in their works, and Albert and his student Thomas were drawing more heavily on Aristotelian notions and really pushing Aristotle. But the Aristotle they were pushing was the Aristotle largely of the Arabic tradition, with a mixture of Aristotle in recent translations. Of course, the one who taught them how to read Aristotle in metaphysics and psychology was Ibn Rushd with his commentaries on De Anima and in metaphysics. So, there are answers to these questions as to why these things are there and why where their inspirations are. Their inspiration is absolutely massive, and everyone has to have a copy of the Ibn Rushd's long commentary in the metaphysics and his De Anima available. Everyone has to read these. Everyone knows these, and all the psychological discussions. They had Ibn Sina's translations and that sort of thing since about 1170, and he was the dominant philosopher because Aristotle's works at that time, they had him piecemeal, but Ibn Sina gives them delightfully well-organized account of metaphysics and psychology. And the Christian theologians were just jumped on it, made great use of it. And then Ibn Rushd came in, they made great use of that as well. They're just deeply imbued in all this material, and the questions are coming out of the Arabic translations. I guess well, that's what I've been working on for a long time. So, and so my colleagues as well. And you know, I'll just put one small plug in here. We have this group called the Aquinas and the Arabs International Working Group. And we're interested in exactly this kind of thing. And it's on philosophy and the Abrahamic traditions. But we work in exactly this to explain that without Ibn Sina, there's no Thomistic metaphysics. And without Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, there's no psychology of Aquinas. It's that strong. So anyway, that's what I'm going to share.
Could I ask a question just on the back of what Richard just said as a non-specialist? So please pardon my ignorance here, but from what I understand, somewhat is that Duns Scotus, Aquinas, people like that were producing commentaries on Aristotle's text, but it wasn't until Suarez that a more systematic engagement with Aristotle took place, that he systematized Aristotle's metaphysics, and that, I suppose, gave the basis for Descartes' attack on, overcoming, let's say, of Aristotle. So what were these Islamic scholars, the philosophers, doing with Aristotle? Was it along the same lines, or was there a more systematic engagement with Aristotle?
I mean, I think you can't say that Suarez exceeds the systematic engagement of the earlier scholastics. I mean, Suarez makes a more fundamental shift in terms of the development of metaphysics, but Aquinas is commentaries, exactly as Richard has been commenting, and Aquinas's and other commentaries on the Aristotelian extant Aristotelian texts are extremely close and tight. I mean, there's a, I mean, I've always, I mean, the way I've explained this in easy terms, as it were, in student contexts, is that Aquinas drags an Aristotle who's recently spent a lot of time in the Arab world to the font and forcibly baptizes him. I mean, that's what actually happens. So it's the opposite of the of what, as it were, we were told in the seminary, which was that Aquinas was an Aristotelian. No, Aristotle was forced to become something of a Thomist, as it were. But now that touches on the question that Oliver raised and that others have raised, and that is, what is the order of precedence? What is the taxis that really works here? Is it that Aquinas is, for Aquinas, Aristotle guarantees what Aquinas believes already to have been revealed? So that this is the question of why were Jews, Muslims, and Christians interested in philosophy? Because philosophy gives an independent guarantee to things that are given by the different versions of divine revelation. And so that is both a point of contact and a point of difference in each case. And so that if you are Aquinas, you have to show that Aristotle's understanding of truth is more consonant with Christian revelation than it is with other forms of revelation. Now, by the time of Suarez, things have moved on a little, and the story is a little different. At least that's how I would explain it.
I want to extend just a little bit more here, and that is to the earlier part of the question, though. In fact, Ibn Sina's metaphysics is the systematized metaphysics, very, very well and clearly argued, that Aristotle never wrote. He's using Aristotelian ideas, but he's reconceptualizing it all and writing a proper book on metaphysics, a proper summa of metaphysics. And so, he knows the text extraordinarily well, and he's revising it. It's an extremely thoughtful work. In the case of Ibn Rushd, his long commentaries on metaphysics and the anima have the complete text of Aristotle. And almost paragraph by paragraph, he's explicating it in detail, very great detail, truly teaching the Latins how to read Aristotle and laying out his positions there. So the systematizing it's already been done by these people, making use of much of the material that are available through the Greek commentaries in Arabic and accounts of them that we don't necessarily have, many of which we don't have extant today in Arabic.
Aaron, I know we're short of time. There was one question I wanted to ask Faisal, if it's at all possible. It strikes me that the connection between Falsafa and Zoroastrianism is one that's very poorly understood and worth at least by many of us. It was reading again Beckwith's work on recent work on Zoroastrianism, which I found patchy, but it threw up lots and lots of questions for me about the relationship between Zoroastrianism and Islam. And I just wondered if, and I think it could be an important component of this project, and I wondered if Faisal would be kind enough just to say a little more about it.
Well, thank you. I think that I too think that's a really important question. Though whether I can address it or not is another question, poses another question, because this is not my field of expertise. But what I think someone like Iqbal recognizes is that, and he recognizes this not simply as an Indian who wants to bring in the Eastern Islamic world into conversation with a scholarship on Islamic philosophy that had largely been confined in his day to the Mediterranean region. So no doubt that is, that informs one part of his investigations into Persian metaphysics. But I think he's also thinking about the way in which figures like Zoroaster and figures from pre-Islamic Iran in particular, but also from India, from Hindu and Buddhist India, are increasingly important in Islamic texts, certainly in the Eastern Islamic world. So, whether or not their presence in these texts is accurate, that is to say, whether the Zoroaster who appears in a 16th century text has anything to do with Zoroaster as he actually was, the very fact of their presence really transforms the referential world of these writers and readers. And I think that is really interesting because these figures, such as Zoroaster or the Buddha for that matter, are not simply forced into already familiar categories. They must represent something distinctive. I think that's one way in which one can think about the inheritance of something like Zoroastrianism in later and indeed even modern Islamic philosophy without needing to draw a straight line between Zoroaster himself and his inheritance, although many such lines could be drawn at the same time. Sorry, if that makes any sense.
No, thank you very much indeed, Faisal. Thank you.
We've reached 4:30, at least here in the UK. So I will now relinquish my duties as chair and hand back over to Nadia for some closing remarks. Nadia. Oh, you're mute.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's been really very stimulating. And I think there are clear indicators that we could continue the exchange of ideas around the project and how it intersects with already established networks or activities or projects that some of you have in your own institutions. And I could almost see strands that could develop into elements where the dialogue between us can lead to shared outputs. We are hoping that we will have regular activities. This is part of the mandate of how the project is situated within the NAP Foundation. And hopefully we could also aim at a certain point to have a symposium in person and engage institutions in the UK also as partners. And this is something that Lawrence is working on quite closely with established academic institutions in the UK. I see strands developing with each one of you in terms of enriching the project and giving it more shape in terms of tying together the various elements that we have evoked in our session today. So this is what I wanted just to hope for, that we could continue our hopefully collaboration.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
On behalf of everyone, we all thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. I much look forward to hearing more about the project and how it goes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.